For white people, we've been living with a politer form of racism. My name is Phelan. I started a Tumblr 2 weeks ago called We Are Not Trayvon Martin. I think the question itself is, why is this a different civil rights moment? I think, we have to think about, well, which other civil rights moments are we comparing it to? If we're talking about the civil rights movement from the 40s through the 70s, it's very different for a lot of the reasons that Rinku laid out in terms of what is the racism that we're actually engaged in and fighting. It's also very different because we supposedly live in a post-racial society, which we've all heard ever since President Obama was elected. And that's a pretty big indicator right there, is that we have a black president, the first black president in history. For white people, we've been living with a politer form of racism. So in the past, during Separate but Equal, during Jim Crow, and during the enslavement of African people, you had explicit cooperation and choice, cooperation and engagement in serious violence, serious limitations of others' rights. We're living in a different time where we're all supposed to be polite and race doesn't exist and we're supposedly colorblind and we've moved on and that's the past. And I think the murder of Trayvon Martin and then the acquittal of his murderer really got to a lot of particularly white people because they thought they really were living in a different time. And this example that became so stark primarily because of new media and the division actually within cable new media to present the facts in a really compelling way, as well as create almost memes out of the hoodie and the Skittles and the iced tea, things that people could actually very much relate to in a very clear way across a racial boundary that they may not have been able to in the past, really allowed people to see themselves in Trayvon Martin, and then as our blog look at how they actually were different from Trayvon Martin and how they actually need to understand their difference from Trayvon in order to understand the larger systems that are at play here, and in order for them to step up and oppose those systems. So I think there's those 3 points. We supposedly live in a post-racial society. We have a kinder, gentler form and politer form of racism. So a lot of white folks don't think about it in the same way. And I think also, if you look at just this panel, if we were talking 60 years ago, 70 years ago, we would not see so many women stepping up and being in visible leadership in the civil rights movement. And I really just think that's an important point to make, is that we are seeing real leadership, and this kind of gets the intersectionality that Ciara's talked about, and also the intersectionality that Rinku talked about in terms of we're looking at justice. We're not just looking at racial justice, we're looking at economic justice, and we're looking at gender justice as well. What is it going to be like in 5 years? I would hope that the strong and powerful civil rights movement that we're reinventing, or the racial justice movement, is actually winning. And so we've heard about all this fight back against the advances that have been made over the last 50 years, and the repeal of a lot of the victories that we've had. I think in 5 years what we are going to see is a reversal of that, primarily because the country is changing, and people, especially younger people, are not going to stand for this in a particular way. Samala talked about the interconnectivity that we have using technology. A study just came out a couple of years ago that white people under 30 are more than twice as likely as white people over 65 to actually engage with a person of color every day of their lives, which I would gather is far more than it was 60 years ago. And by pure nature of people developing interpersonal relationships, and by activity and movements supporting a different framework for how those relationships can unfold, both at the individual and institutional level, I think we are going to see some really powerful victories. And those victories are going to be led by young people with computers and cell phones and markers and cardboard, and people who want to occupy the Capitol in Tallahassee. I could name, probably 30 capitals that should be occupied right now. And I'm sure we're going to see more and more of this type of direct action that's also going to continue to spark both political change and cultural change, like Rinku said.